On the cold night of April 14, 1912, the world's most famous passenger liner, the RMS Titanic, struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic and sank just a few hours later. More than 1,500 people lost their lives, turning what was meant to be a historic maiden voyage into one of the deadliest maritime disasters in history. For decades, the tragedy has been explained in simple terms. The Titanic hit an iceberg and sank. But a deeper examination raises a more important question. Was the iceberg truly the main cause, or was human negligence the real reason behind the disaster? At first glance, the iceberg appears to be the obvious culprit. The North Atlantic shipping lanes were known to contain drifting ice during the spring months. In April, large icebergs break away from Greenland's glaciers and move south into busy maritime routes. On the night of the disaster, the iceberg that crossed the Titanic's path caused damage along the starboard side of the hull, allowing water to enter multiple compartments. The ship's design allowed it to stay afloat with up to 4 compartments flooded. That night, 6 were breached. From a purely physical perspective, the iceberg delivered the damage that made the sinking inevitable. However, icebergs were not unexpected hazards. Ships crossing the North Atlantic regularly received ice reports and adjusted their routes or speed accordingly. What makes the Titanic's story different is not the presence of ice, but how the risk was managed. Throughout April 14th, the Titanic received multiple wireless messages warning of heavy ice in its path. Ships such as the Coronia Baltic and Californian reported icebergs, pack ice, and dangerous conditions directly along the route the Titanic was following. These warnings were not vague or distant. They described conditions in the exact area the ship would enter later that night. Some of these warnings were delivered to the bridge, and Captain Edward Smith was aware that ice had been reported, yet the ship continued traveling at nearly full speed, around 22 knots. At such a speed, the time available to detect and avoid an iceberg was extremely limited. This decision reflects one of the most significant elements of negligence: the failure to reduce speed despite repeated warnings of danger. Environmental conditions made the situation even more risky. The sea was unusually calm, and the night was clear but moonless. Normally, waves breaking against the base of an iceberg create visible foam, making it easier to detect, but the calm water removed this natural warning sign. The dark sky made it difficult to distinguish objects on the horizon. These conditions reduced visibility and increased the stopping distance required to avoid obstacles. Continuing at high speed under such circumstances greatly increased the likelihood of a collision. Communication priorities also played a role. The Titanic's wireless system was busy handling passenger messages, which were a paid service. As a result, some ice warnings were delayed or not delivered promptly to the bridge. One of the most important messages came from the Californian, which had stopped for the night because it was surrounded by heavy ice. When the Californian attempted to send this information, the Titanic's wireless operator asked not to be interrupted because he was transmitting passenger traffic. The warning never reached the officers in charge of navigation. The lookout conditions represented another layer of risk. The crew in the crow's nest did not have binoculars because the key to the equipment locker had been misplaced before departure. While experts debate how much difference binoculars would have made on a dark night, their absence reflected a broader issue. Preparation did not match the level of risk the ship was entering. At 11:40 p.m., the lookout finally spotted the iceberg directly ahead. A warning bell was rung, and First Officer William Murdoch immediately ordered the ship to turn and engines to reverse. But at the ship's speed and size, there was not enough time or distance to avoid contact. The iceberg scraped along the hull for several seconds, opening seams between steel plates and allowing water to enter. Even after the collision, the impact itself did not appear dramatic. There was no massive shock or visible hole. Many passengers did not even realize anything had happened. This calm reaction contributed to another form of negligence: the initial underestimation of the damage. It took time for the ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, to assess the flooding and determine that the ship would sink within a few hours. During this time, valuable minutes were lost. The evacuation process revealed additional failures. The Titanic carried lifeboats for only about half the people on board. This decision complied with outdated maritime regulations, but it did not reflect the ship's actual capacity. Even worse, several lifeboats were launched only partially filled because of confusion, fear of overloading, and lack of clear procedures. Better training and planning could have saved many more lives. Nearby assistance also illustrates how multiple layers of negligence contributed to the loss of life. The Californian was relatively close to the Titanic and saw distressed rockets fired into the sky. However, its crew did not interpret them as signals of a major emergency. Its wireless operator had gone to sleep and was not monitoring distress calls. Continuous radio watch was not yet required, but this gap in communication proved deadly. When examining the disaster as a whole, it becomes clear that the iceberg was the triggering event, but not the root cause. The iceberg did what icebergs always do. It drifted silently in a known danger zone. The real issue was the series of human decisions that increased exposure to risk. Negligence in this context does not necessarily mean reckless behavior or intentional wrongdoing. It reflects a pattern of assumptions and priorities. There was confidence in the ship's strength and reputation. There was pressure to maintain schedule and performance. There was a belief that modern technology had reduced traditional maritime risks. Each individual decision seemed reasonable at the time. Together, they created a situation where a single obstacle became catastrophic. Investigations conducted after the disaster by British and American authorities reached similar conclusions. They determined that excessive speed in ice conditions was a major factor. They also criticized the lack of lifeboats, inadequate emergency preparation, and failures in communication. The tragedy led to sweeping changes in maritime safety. Ships were required to carry enough lifeboats for everyone on board. Continuous 24-hour wireless monitoring became mandatory. Regular safety drills were introduced. The International Ice Patrol was established to track iceberg movements and provide warnings to ships crossing the North Atlantic. These reforms highlight the true lesson of the Titanic. The disaster was not simply an unavoidable accident caused by nature. It was the result of risk that was known but not managed carefully enough. The question of iceberg or negligence is therefore not an either-or choice. The iceberg caused the physical damage, but negligence created the conditions that made the collision likely and the loss of life so severe. If the ship had slowed after receiving ice warnings, the collision might have been avoided. If more lifeboats had been available, hundreds more could have survived. If communication systems had been handled differently, help might have arrived sooner. More than a century later, the Titanic remains a powerful example of how complex disasters occur. They rarely result from a single cause. Instead, they develop through a chain of small decisions, overlooked warnings, and misplaced confidence. The iceberg was the visible cause. Negligence was the underlying one. The real tragedy of the Titanic is not that it encountered ice in the North Atlantic. Many ships did, and still do. The tragedy is that the warning signs were there reported by other vessels, visible in environmental conditions, and reflected in safety limitations, but they were not treated with the level of caution the situation required. In the end, the Titanic did not sink because nature was unpredictable. It sank because human judgment underestimated predictable risk. That is why the story continues to matter today. It is not only a historical disaster, but a lasting reminder that technology, reputation, and confidence can never replace careful planning, clear communication, and respect for known dangers. The iceberg may have torn open the hull, but it was human decisions that placed the ship and everyone on board directly in its path.